The COVID-19 pandemic have made a great impact on our life and have left us devastated. Though we can't change it, but we can pave a way forward. I would like to start with very famous lines, which is something like, "What's done is done. You can't go back and change it. It's time to move on. You can't rearrange it. You have paid your price, and it's time to proceed." Hi, I am Shishir, and I welcome all the speakers and the participants in this webinar. Now, without wasting time, I shall hand over the session to Professor Preeti Mishra, Head Department of Human Rights.
Thank you, Shishir. A very good evening to all. Myself, Preeti Mishra, on behalf of myself and on behalf of Department of Human Rights, as well as on behalf of the organizing committee, I extend a very warm welcome to you all in this very first national webinar of the Department of Human Rights, School of Legal Studies, Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, on the topic Pandemic Health Law and the Response of International Law. On behalf of organizing committee and my own behalf, first of all, I would welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sanjay Singh Ji, Veteran in Chief, who has always been a source of great inspiration and motivation in all our academic endeavors. Due to his other very important engagements, he is not with us, but his blessings are with us. I welcome you, sir. I welcome our patron, Professor Preeti Saxena, Director, Center for Postgraduate Legal Studies, Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, Lucknow. She has always been a source of great strength to our department. She is also presiding over this national webinar. I heartily welcome our speakers of today's national webinar, eminent Professor Shri Arvind Jasotia ji, former Head and Dean, Department of Law, University of Jammu, currently Director, Colleges Development. Despite his various engagements, he was able to take his time out for this particular webinar. I am highly obliged to him for keeping my word and honoring this webinar with his gracious presence. I welcome you, sir, on this national platform. I have also the pleasure to welcome Dr. Bhanu Pratap, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Law, Lucknow University, and a scholar par excellence. And I also take pride in announcing that Dr. Bhanu is an alumni of our Department of Human Rights. Whatever task is assigned to him, he always comes out with flying colors. I welcome Dr. Bhanu to the forum of national seminar. From the core of my
Thank you.
heart, I welcome and express my gratitude to all the participants of this webinar from all corners of the country, north, south, east, and west, ranging from Jammu, Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tripura, Karnataka, Chhattisgarh, Madras, Gujarat, West Bengal, Haryana, Rajasthan, Uttaranchal, Bihar, Odisha, Jharkhand, and Punjab to Kerala. I am really overwhelmed with responses received from the nooks and corners of the country. I am happy to announce that more than 500 participants have shown their keen interest in the topic and registered themselves for this webinar from all over India, including faculties, academicians, students of different universities, colleges, and institutions. I welcome you all to this national webinar. Now, in very brief, I would like to throw light on the background of present national seminar as our esteemed speakers are here to discuss things in detail. The coronavirus pandemic is currently creating havoc throughout the world. WHO has put a dashboard, coronavirus disease COVID-19, updating daily data of this pandemic. It reveals that cases of this pandemic have soared to near about 48 lakhs throughout the world. The current crisis has acquired a multidimensional nature, affecting all levels of society, from day-to-day affairs to deteriorating economy and public health and straining of international relations between the countries. Measures adopted by domestic authorities have included a broad spectrum of restrictions, from general alerts to mandatory quarantine and isolation of individuals to blanket travel bans and cordoning off of cities, and in some cases, countries. Many governments have declared states of emergency even. The World Health Organization, a specialized agency of the United Nations, the National
Vasu, Biplab, तो यहाँ से डालेंगे वहीं से डालेंगे अभी नहीं तो डालेंगे
Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Shashi Kumar, Associate Professor, Department of Human Rights, to introduce the speakers.
Hello, good evening, all the viewers. I'm Shashi Kumar in Department of Human Rights.
of India,
I
I
have
am
been
eagerly
trusted
looking
task
forward to an exciting, thought-provoking session igniting the minds on this current pandemic regarding public health law and international response. Once again, I welcome you all in the national webinar and now request Dr. Shashi Kumar ji, Associate Professor at Department of Human Rights, to formally introduce our speakers of the day. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, madam. I have been interested asked for introducing the speakers. Today, in this webinar, we have a two eminent speaker who is going to deliver on lecture on pandemic, global health, and response of international law. The first speaker would be the Professor Arvind Sotia, who is the head and dean, Faculty of Law, Ministry of Jammu, and he has been associated with many assignments, like he has been Director of College Development Council, Director Law School, IUCN Commission on Environmental Law, member of NACP team. He has also completed many projects of the ICSR and the UGC. His area of interest is constitutional law, environmental law, and human rights law. Today he is with us and he is going to deliver a lecture on international health regulations vis-a-vis COVID-19 pandemic. We have another speaker who is also our alumni, Dr. Bhanu Pratap, who is the Assistant Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Lucknow. He did his LLM in Human Rights from our university, BBIU, and did his PhD from Lucknow University. He has authored a textbook on international law, and his area of interest is international law and disputes. Today he is going to speak on international law and global health. He is going to focus on the Constitution of World Health Regulations, international health regulations, and state responsibility. I think we people are going to join and we will enjoy their lecture, and we are going to have some questions also after that, which they will going to respond. Thank you, madam.
Over to you, sir.
Hello. Now I invite Professor Arvind Jasotia for his lecture on the theme.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, audible.
Okay. Good evening to all of you. At the very outset, I would like to thank Professor Preeti Mishra and Professor Preeti Saxena for giving me an opportunity to speak to this August audience in this national webinar on pandemic, global health law, and response of international law. Friends, I will be step by going to the subject matter, reason being there may be some of the connectivity issues in this state. We have a 2G connections. My presentation has been divided into 5 parts. First, we'll discuss the basic of COVID-19 pandemic. Second part will be about the source of virus. Then third part will be devoted to what is the conduct of China in this regard. And then fourth part will be what are the litigations or suits which have been instituted against China. Then fifth part would be devoted to global health law, and probably my co-panelists will be taking care of draft articles on state responsibility and including observations. And basically, to start with, I would say that human activities which are motivated by an unsustainable patterns of production and consumption have never been human towards the environment. They had a very callous attitude, and this catastrophic situation in which we are having today, it is basically the virus which causes COVID-19 illness. The name of the virus says SARS-CoV-2, and the illness which it causes is popularly known as COVID-19. So this virus was unknown to the science before December 2019. And scientists, it is very contagious disease, you know, and scientists, when they try to measure the contagiousness of this particular disease, they say they measure it with the R0 factor. R0 factor means that the property of the virus and the human contact. So the scientists say that the R0 factor of this dangerous disease virus is basically 2 to 2.5. That is, a person who has been infected by this virus has the potential to infect 3 more persons if those persons do not have any immunity from this particular virus. Now, till date, this COVID-19 has infected 4.8 million people worldwide with 378,000 deaths. In India, you can also see that there is the number have exceeded 1 lakh, and death which have occurred is more than 3,000. This crisis actually has no precedent. There are no rules. Governments, they were unaware how to close their economies and how to open up their economies. There were rich worlds also which whose health and other infrastructure has been totally breached. And when you look at the developing nations or the third world countries or those poor people who have lost their earnings, the situation is very critical. Therefore, I would say that COVID-19 is a health crisis, you know, looking at the number of deaths it has caused. It is a social crisis, you know, the how institutions have crumbled, how even we are conducting these webinars even on the Zoom and other platforms. It is an economic crisis. Look at the vast number of people who have lost their jobs and the amount of deprivation which is caused by this virus. To top of it, it is an existential crisis. That's why there is a whole solidarity. The whole of the world has come closer to actually find ways, actually finding certain vaccines to fight COVID-19 virus. So it is a health crisis, it is a social crisis, it is an economic crisis, and it is an existential crisis also. There are also certain environmentalists who are saying that nature is reclaiming its space. As I've told you, that these human activities which are motivated by rampant consumerism, unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, they have been very inhuman and callous towards environment. We have other problems pertaining to environment also, which are also having existential dimensions. For example, problem pertaining to climate change, depletion of ozone layer, radioactive waste, biodiversity loss all over the world. So nature is reclaiming space means that suddenly sky has become clearer, waters have become clearer, transportation has come to an halt, and therefore we are able to breathe. Yesterday, a report has come that global carbon emissions are predicted to fall between 4 to 7% this year compared to the last year. The last year prediction was it is going to rise by 1%, and now the prediction is going to fall by 5% in this year. But that doesn't mean we are having a very stable climate. It is because when we talk about climate change, it is basically the cumulative carbon emissions. So it is only going to lesser global warming by 0.0001%. So not a big deal. Therefore, the flourishing of nature actually should not be at the cost of human suffering. Time and again, we are emphasizing the concept of sustainable development and how should we should keep harmony with the nature. We are trying to have an ecocentric approach to the nature, a compassionate attitude towards the nature. Unless and until humankind becomes a part of the nature and not a controller of the nature, these things are going to happen. So this is the basic background of COVID-19, that COVID-19 has, the virus is called SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, SARS-CoV-2, and COVID-19 is basically the illness which has been caused by this virus. Now let us come to the source of this virus. What is the source of this virus? That there is certain theories that COVID-19 has, there's a conspiracy theory. It has been hatched in the laboratory in the city of Wuhan. But a very credible scientist and researchers have come to the conclusion when they compared the genome sequence data of COVID-2 and earlier coronavirus strain. They have come to the conclusion that it has come from nature. It has not originated in any lab. That is the first thing which they have told. Number two is, just like other viruses, for example, we had HIV, we have SARS, we have Ebola, even we have measles. They have also come from animals to humans because humans have tried to enter into the habitat of animals. So they have jumped from animals to human, and there is a transmission from animal to human. But from human to human transmission, whether this case or not, China was silent on this particular sphere, isn't it? But there is absolutely no doubt that this is a zoonotic source. The virus has jumped from probably bats, which was in the Wuhan city of China, from bats to humans, either through direct contact or through species or certain other matters. It has jumped from animals to humans. Now the third thing is, let's look at the conduct of China. I'll take back you to 2002. In 2002, severe acute respiratory syndrome. This spread from Guangdong province of China to, it affected 28 nation states. There were 774 deaths, and China concealed this vital information. This information was not disclosed to World Health Organization, with the result that people realized that had China acted swiftly, there would have been lesser deaths. This happened in 2002. So I'm speaking about the persistence of China in hiding vital information, in not sharing the information. Now, let's come to 2019. In 2019, so that's why WHO amended its regulations, which we call International Health Regulation, in the year 2005, whereby there is an obligation upon the member states to immediately pass information to the WHO within 24 hours if there is any public health issue of international concern. Now, let's take the case of year 2019. China's silence actually in the earlier days about the severity of this disease, which was spreading within its border, China tried to suppress information. So much so that one scientist who tried to leak this information to a WhatsApp group, his name is Dr. Li Wenling, he was forced on January 3 to sign a statement that this was an untrue speech. Ultimately, the same scientist coronavirus on February 7, 2020. Now, on December 31st, when China first announced the outbreak of this mysterious pneumonia, officials emphasized few things. They said that certain patients, they have gone to the Wuhan city of China, and there they had certain interactions, certain purchase at the live stream market, the food market, the live animal market, and therefore they contracted disease. So they said that they have evidence of animal to human transmission, but there is no evidence of human to human transmission. This particular vital information, which was very vital, this China did not disclose. Whereas if you see independent information which were coming to the WHO, which was shared by Taiwan, which was shared by the newspaper and other channels, they said that you can go as far as October. In the month of October 2019, this was for the first time when there were patients pertaining to COVID-19, and it was to human transmission. So this was a large gap of roughly 2 to 3 months, and China disclosed it only on December 31st. Now, China did share the genetic sequence, the genome sequence of this particular virus, but then it did not share other information, the day-to-day information. I did not share its results with the other labs also, or with the different regions also. It did not share. This was also a fault on the part of China. Then China also refused repeated offers which were made by the USA Center for Disease Control. Even by WHO also, there were repeated offers that kindly invite our experts to the Wuhan city so that we can actually know what is the type of this virus, what is this strain, and how can we develop a vaccine. This was all denied till February 19, when for the first time WHO tweeted that it is sending their delegation to China for knowing more about the virus, but not to the city of Wuhan yet. Now, this is due to the secrecy and delay on the part of China. The world had less time to prepare and react to the COVID-19, because by the time China broke this news, estimated 5 million people, they have left the city of Wuhan. They have gone to the other cities of China. They have gone overseas, and with the result, there was a human-to-human transmission, and this virus spread all over the world. And now we are facing the consequences as an existential crisis. Now, what is the cases which have been filed against China? There are a few cases. I'll just mention it. We'll not discuss these cases. For example, in India, a petition has been filed in the Supreme Court seeking a direction for the central government to file a case before the ICJ that China has violated Biological Weapons Convention Act. It has stockpiled biological and toxic weapons, and China has species against India. It wants to destroy the economy of India. This was the first case. Then US state of Missouri also, it filed a lawsuit in the federal court alleging that China government is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. It has delayed the sharing of the information. It has concealed all the vital information pertaining to the strain of coronavirus. Therefore, there's roughly $1 trillion suit which has been filed in the. Then there is a class action suit which has been filed in the district courts of Texas also, asking for the punitive damages. And the theory which has been propounded is that this is a conspiracy which has been hatched in the lab in China, as a consequence of which the whole of the world is facing. Now, yesterday also, European Union, supported by Australia and other countries, moved a resolution in the WHO General Assembly asking for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation of international response to the pandemic. Look at the wordings. These are impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation of the international response to the pandemic. It is not asking about who is responsible, right? This is probably because China is diplomatically very strong. It is militarily very, very strong. It is a permanent member of the Security Council. It is giving a lot of funding to the WHO, which is, by the way, doesn't receive funding from the state. It is based on the voluntary contributions from the governments as well as from the private organizations. This may be one of the reasons. Now, let's look at the global health law. When we talk about the global health law, it is basically a relative new academic field, but it has the intimations from international environment law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Then we have international trade and labor law, international law relating to arms control. But specifically, when we talk about health threats or issues of health importance, this global health law concerns either international health regulations, which have been duly made in the 5, or it refers to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So the IHR refers to infectious diseases, and Tobacco Control Convention, Framework Convention, refers to the chronic diseases. Now, China's conduct related to COVID-19 violated IHR regulations. There was a clear-cut violation. The regulations which were violated knowingly and deliberately are Article 6 and Article 7. Article 6 speaks about timely notification. Article 7 speaks about information sharing. Both these things have been violated blatantly by China in this pandemic. For example, Article 6 talks about public health emergency of international concern, that in the event of public health emergency of international concern, the state have to communicate through national IHR focal point most efficiently all public related information and events taking place within its territory to the WHO within 24 hours. So this is to be reported within 24 hours. Presumably that it started in the month of October. There was a transmission from animals to humans, then from humans to humans, October, November, December. China did not disclose the information. It held whole of the city of Wuhan under quarantine mode, right? It was only when there was a hue and cry and independent evidences which went to the WHO, or the Taiwan authorities presented some evidences to the WHO. China ultimately declared it on December. So there's a violation of Article 6 of the IHR regulation. There is a violation of Article 7 of the IHR regulation, which says imposes an obligation upon states to share public health information with WHO, even the origin or source of the disease, even if it is not known to the state. And China throughout conceal this particular vital information, that what is the strain of this virus, until it discloses it as an outbreak. Now, but the difficulty lies in identifying a jurisdictional basis. What is the jurisdictional basis whereby we can catch hold of China, right? Or make China responsible under international court or tribunal. Article 56 of the IHR provides for a mechanism of arbitration. There's no doubt about this. But this mechanism of arbitration would be applicable only if China gives a consent, because this is consent based. If China doesn't give a consent, and it is unlikely that China is going to give a consent, am I audible?
Yes, sir, audible है.
Okay. Uh, Therefore, a state has to actually frame its complaint in such a manner that it is seen as a violation of WHO constitution, which also is very difficult. Then one of the other provisions, if you look at the WHO constitution, Article 1 of the WHO constitution says, what is the object? Object and purpose of WHO constitution is the attainment of by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. Now, if you look at the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, particularly Article 18, it says there's an obligation under general international law not to defeat the object and purpose of this treaty. And China, by his willful conduct, by deliberately hiding the information, has actually agreed to the World Constitution, WHO Constitution, primarily Article 1. So under Article 1, there is a chance that you can bring your claims under Article 1 of the WHO Constitution, citing Article 18 of the VLCT. Now, apart from this, there are draft articles on state responsibility, which my co-panelists will take. But draft article also, they are basically not approved. They are presented to the general
Now I would like to invite Dr. Bhanu Pratap from Lucknow University, Faculty of Law. मैम अरविंद सर को ऐड कर ले, सर स्टूडियो में आ गए हैं तो। Sir, you may continue.
Me?
Yes, sir, you may continue.
Okay. So I'll just make a conclusion that taking to a state to ICJ or any other international tribunal is basically Herculean task, because it is international adjudication is basically a consent based. or this is highly unlikely that China would succumb to these particular pressures, particularly when China is, as I told you, militarily very strong, diplomatically very strong, and China is strategically also well placed. It wants to even hold over the certain regions of the world, and also it's a permanent member of the Security Council. For instance, we presume that ICJ finds jurisdiction in any of the articles of IHR regulations, Article 6 or Article 7, or maybe Article 1 of the WHO Constitution. Presumably it finds, and then it gives a judgment also. How will you impose? Because once the judgment is to be imposed, again in case of default, the matter would go to ICJ, and there also China has a veto power, and China can apply the veto power. Another provision, Article 96 of the UN Charter, basically speaks with advisory jurisdiction also. For advisory jurisdiction, it is not necessary that you have to obtain consent of China. You can, it can be easily on behalf of either the General Assembly or by any of the international organizations which are acting in concert with the General Assembly, and we can have a safe advisory opinion against China. But that would be more like shaming China. Shaming China, but it would not be having a sound judgment whereby you can ask China to pay a certain amount of dollars to all of the world as a compensation. I don't see any possibility at this stage of time, but definitely if you see yesterday's letter which was tweeted by Trump, it has actually castigated WHO also. That WHO has acted as the puppet of China. If you see the initial response of WHO, because the Taiwan has given information that there is a human-to-human transmission, that information was within the domain of WHO. It was not disclosed. And on the contrary, even Trump also said that China is, at one point of time, he said that China is acting in a very professional way. WHO, through its Director General, gave the same statement that China is doing its best to contain the virus. This information that this virus is human transmitted, or that certain people have gone out of the city of Wuhan, was not shared either by WHO or by China. And one of the articles of the WHO says that its Director General and the staff of WHO should act partially, should not be under influence of any of the states which are parties to the WHO. But the evidence shows that WHO acted under pressure from China, because China, you know, is giving million dollar aids to WHO, which was also disclosed yesterday by the tweet which was given by Trump. And that's why the aspersion can be cast on the conduct of WHO in delaying the whole of the matters. But what I want to point out is that Article 1 of WHO, Article 6 of IHR regulations, Article 7 of the IHR regulations, and draft articles on state responsibility to make China accountable under relevant articles actually makes a sound case. Because the case would be that China has deliberately withheld the information. China has kept every information under the wraps. On the contrary, if you want to say that this was particularly a conspiracy which was hatched in the lab of Wuhan, and it was a bioweapon which was let loose on the whole of the world, frankly, I don't see any possibility, particularly when many of the researchers, many of the scientists are saying that the strain of CoV2 is the same as the earlier strains of the coronavirus, and it is definitely a genetic source. It has definitely come from animals, and from animals to man, and ultimately from human to human transmission, it has happened. So therefore, China's delay in reporting the matters, China's delay in suppressing the information, China's conduct in influencing the WHO Director General and the staff of WHO, and then expecting certain statements from them which favors China, is actually undoing on the part of China. Today, I've heard the news that China is ready to give certain $1 billion for the to help those nations who are actually fighting a pandemic. But that is just a small bomb which is used by China in this period of time. But actually, it was totally an existential crisis, a health crisis, economic crisis, a social crisis, and economies. But of course, environmentalists must be happy that nature is reclaiming the space. But even then, the UNFCCC convention, which was to happen in Glasgow this year, it got delayed. Biodiversity convention, it got delayed, and mm, this particular jump of humans into the animal terrains, this need to be stopped on an environmental front also. That was my brief submissions. Now I am ready to take any questions if I'm audible. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry there was certain problem relating to communication networks. It got broke twice uh, because of the 2G, which is in JNK. So I'm sorry for that. Thank you. Any questions? I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Dr. Bhanu Pratap, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Lucknow. Over to you, sir. Sir, you are not audible.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir, now audible.
Should I start?
Okay, sir.
Should I start?
Yes, sir, start.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Bhanu Pratap, Faculty of Law from University of Lucknow. I would like to thank the organizing committee of Department of Human Rights, and I would like to extend my thanks to Dr. Preeti Mishra, Dr. Preeti Saxena, Dr. Rashida Athar, Dr. Shashi Kumar, all of them who have been my teachers and mentors. And it's an honor to be in this august presence. And I would like to deliver my lecture on the topic international law and global health. And the structure of the lecture is as follows. I would like to give a brief introduction about the concept of global governance, because that is the main issue that connects global health and international law. And then I'll proceed to give a brief introduction about the Constitution of World Health Organization. Then I'll move to the important elements of international health regulations. Then I'll give a brief introduction of state responsibility. And then lastly, I would conclude with the liability of any particular state as far as the outbreak of the virus is concerned. If a particular state is to be blamed, what legal mechanisms are available to us? Now, this discussion of mine is going to be prescriptive, is going to be descriptive in nature. I'm just going to lay out the bare skeleton of international law that is available before us, because the situation is new, and whatever legal arguments we are making right now, they're completely hypothetical, because this is an unprecedented situation, and we can present our thesis and hypothesis, and it's for time to decide which one are correct. So I'll make my best efforts to complement to whatever Professor Arvind has said, and I'd like to substantiate my own argument. Now, as I've already mentioned, the topic of my lecture is international law and global health. So I would like to start my discussion on a skeptical note, because both international law and global health have not been very popular in the academic circles. We have ignored them for a very long time, and I would like to say that international law and global health are very prophetic in nature. The reason I'm saying is because this outbreak of coronavirus is not something new, as this has already discussed, and most of us are already aware of the fact that the first instance was reported in 2003. Quote, a comment by the IHR Emergency Committee way back in July 17 and 2013. And I'm of the opinion that this is the first time that the international community was warned about the present coronavirus, about its form and its content. So this is an excerpt from the meeting of it, and it's a WHO statement on the second meeting of IHR Emergency Committee, MERS-CoV, July 17, 2013. Now, the committee had said the following words, and I quote: to understand the constantly evolving threat of pathogens, consider a recent emergence of a novel coronavirus, a beta coronavirus known as Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, and it was abbreviated as MERS or MERS-CoV. In September 2012, scientists reported this novel coronavirus in a person who hailed from Qatar and had a travel history to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Tunisia, UAE, as well as in France, Italy, and UK. Globally, from September 2012 to November 4, 2013, the WHO reported 150 laboratory confirmed cases of infection with MERS-CoV, including 60 deaths. The MERS-CoV does not appear to be easily transmissible from human to human, and it probably has an animal origin, possibly bats or camels. Health officials are remaining vigilant to the possibility that a future mutation could render the virus transmissible between humans. Now, this is an excerpt from the WHO statement of its emergency committee of IHR, and it was reported way back in July 17th and 2013. Yet, as scholars of international law, we did not pay any heed to this prophetic statement by by the emergency committee of the WHO. And this is the problem that we are facing now. So from 2030 to 2020, we are in midst of an pandemic, and this is the situation that we have come to. Now, as far as international law is concerned, its relation with global health law and the constitution of World Health Organization and international health regulations is very simple. Global health law is one of the species of international health law. More or less, it's a treaty. And by virtue of being a treaty, it has given birth to an international legal personality called World Health Organization. So, as far as our current situation is concerned, all of us are aware that the outbreak of a pandemic cannot be controlled simply by states. It requires the cooperation of intergovernmental organizations, non governmental organizations, the citizens, and the entire international community. So, during the time of pandemic, and especially during the times of corona crisis that we are facing, what we have to focus is not on government but on the notion of governance. So at present, the best method to combat coronavirus is the issue of global governance. Now the term governance is very much different from government. Governance, unlike the word government, does not have the features of an established hierarchy, a sovereign authority, or the enforcement of power. Now, according to Thomas Weiss, governance is all about piloting and steering. It is more than the authoritative allocation of values and a national social order. So, the focus shifts from government to governance. And most importantly, what is the function of global governance? The function of global governance is to define, constitute, and mediate the relations among citizens, society, market, and state. So, this is the issue that we are facing right now. Now, as far as the issue of uh, global health law, pandemic, and international law is concerned, I would like to give a brief introduction as to the constitution and the working mechanism of World Health Organization. And then we'll shift to the concept of state responsibility and we'll investigate as to whether one particular state can be held responsible for the outbreak of uh, a pandemic or a virus like Cotwin. Now, the Bible of global health law is written by Lawrence Goldstein in the year 2014 and simply called the Global Health Law. In that book, Lawrence Goldstein has given a term called viral sovereignty. Now, for the first time, Goldstein was of the view that can any particular country or any particular state be blamed for the outbreak of a virus that may create an epidemic or pandemic. Now, if a pandemic breaks out, can a particular country be held accountable? And if yes, what are the relevant provisions in international law? Now, in the year 2014, the question was moot because a couple of Middle East countries were being blamed uh, for the outbreak of the MERS-CoV that I had introduced in my introductory statement. So now is the time to assess that situation. Now, as far as World Health Organization is concerned, it had a couple of predecessors. And if we want to talk about the global health law, the first working institution that came into being was International Sanitary Conference in the year 1851, and its function was to control the infectious disease control. Now, a working mechanism was set up to implement the vision of International Sanitary Conference, and it was called International Sanitary Convention. Now, this came in the year 1892. Now, as far as International Sanitary Convention is concerned, it can be seen as a predecessor of international health regulations. Now, after the setting up of International Sanitary Conference and International Sanitary Convention in 1892, an authoritative agency was needed to supervise the implementation of the 1892 convention. And thus was created the first recorded uh, international health organization called PAHO, Pan American Health Organization. Now, it is from the Pan American Health Organization that WHO took over its functions. So, the real successor of World Health Organization is Pan American Health Organization. Now, when the Charter of United Nations came into being, it was comprised of six main organs as given in the Article 7 of the Charter of United Nations. And one of the main organs of the Charter of United Nations, Economic and Social Council, constituted a specialized health agency on February 15th, 1946, and it went on to be called the World Health Organization. Now, as far as the World Health Organization is concerned, we being the students of international law, we must understand the working structure of a World Health Organization. Then we'll move on to the more controversial international health regulations, and then we'll see what sort of accountability a particular state can be attributed to. Now, as far as the World Health Organization is concerned, it is simply composed of four organs: the World Health Assembly, the Executive Board, the Secretariat, and regional offices. So these are the four uh, basic governing bodies of the World Health Organization, and the main organ is World Health Assembly. It is a principal decision-making body, and it convenes its meetings in May, the one that is going on recently, and it is also responsible for policy and budget. World Health Assembly is responsible for the appointment of Director General for a period of 5 years. It also tends to instruct uh, the Executive Board and Director General on action and investigation. And the World Health Assembly itself is composed of two committees, Committee A and Committee B. Now, Committee A usually performs administrative work like the programming and budgeting of the World Health regulations, and Committee B is the responsible for the financial and legal activities of World Health Organization. The executive board is the executive organ of World Health Organization, as the name suggests, and it meets twice a year. One meeting is held in January, and one short meeting is held in the month of May. And its function is to implement the policies that have already been drafted by the World Health Assembly. Now, as far as the third organ of World Health Organization is concerned, it is called the Secretariat, and it is composed of the Director General. Now, as far as the Director General is concerned, it is responsible for being the technical and administrative staff of WHO, and Director General is also the ex officio of the Secretary of the Assembly Board, and all committees and conferences are attributed to him, and he is responsible for raising resources, influence, and coordinating states and stakeholders all around the world. Now, there is a very important article in World Health Organization Constitution, and that is Article 37. Now, it clearly states that Director General of World Health Organization cannot take instructions from any government or external organization or have a conflict of interest, including improper remuneration. Now, if anyone could prove a nexus or shenanigans or evil nexus between the Director General of World Health Organization and China, this is the article that they can attribute to if they prepare to reach an appropriate judicial tribunal and to prosecute China. So Article 37 is very important because it clearly states that the Director General should not be influenced by any political shenanigans of any powerful nation. Now, as far as the World Health Organization is concerned, it is the constitution of World Health Organization is based on three norms, or there are three pillars of World Health Organization, and those three pillars are science, ethics, and human rights. The entire constitution of World Health Organization and the constitution of International Health Regulation is an interplay between the health law, human rights, and trade law, and all of this is coming under the umbrella of scientific analysis and temperament. Now, as far as the preamble of World Health Organization is concerned, it gives a very comprehensive understanding of the term health. According to the preamble, health is not simply a physical or mental state. It is a notion of social well-being, and it's not just about diseases or infirmity. So, World Health Organization is giving an enabling definition or a positive definition and a very comprehensive understanding of the term health. And enjoyment of health is a fundamental right of every human being. And right to health, as most of the students of human rights must be knowing, is explicitly stated under Article 12 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, as far as Article 2 of World Health Organization is concerned, it talks about the extensive normative powers to carry out its missions, authorizing the World Health Assembly to adopt conventions, agreements, and regulations, and make recommendations with respect to international health uh, regulations. Now, as far as Article 2 is concerned, it is giving a basic function of World Health Organization as to how it is on what basis and on what principles it is supposed to cooperate with its member states. Now, in the same strike, we can see two more articles, Article 23 and Article 62. Article 23 of Health Organization says that the World Health Assembly has the power and authority to make recommendation to members. And Article 62 says that states have to report annually of their action taken to comply with those recommendations. So Article 23 is giving the power to World Health Organization, to World Health Assembly, to give recommendations to its member, and the members, when they accept it, they have to give their annual report. And it is also called the epidemiological report. The report is connected to all deadly viruses that may or may not break out in a particular country. So states are under a legal obligation. So as far as the World Health Organization is concerned, there are four very important articles as far as the law of treaty is concerned, and those are Article 19, 20, 21, and 22. These articles are unique and they present an exception to the general law of treaty. Now, as far as Article 19 of the Constitution of WHO is concerned, it simply states that the WHO has the power to adopt conventions or agreements by a two-third vote. Now, this is just like the process of signature, ratification, and accession that are explicitly stated in Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties. But how the World Health Organization differs from the traditional law of treaty, this is stated under Article 20 and 22 of the Constitution of WHO. Article 22, as I've already stated, it is exceptional in nature because it directs the members to take action by accepting or rejecting the convention. So either you have to accept and reject or the agreement within 18 months of the adoption by the World Health Assembly. And this is the part where things get interesting. Even in cases where the member states World Health Assembly delegation voted against the treaty adoption, so each member must notify the Director General of the action it has taken, such as submission of the treaty for ratification. If a member has not acceded to the treaty within an allotted time, it must furnish a statement of reason. Now, this is very peculiar because under the law of treaty, as most of us are aware of the fact that the state are the masters of the treaty. But if you are acceding to a treaty or if you are not acceding to a treaty, if you're acceding to a treaty, then fine. But if you're not acceding to the treaty, then member states have to give a reason to the Director General, and that too within a time bound period. Most of us know that there is no time limit for the ratification of a treaty, but in this case it is an exception. So this is a powerful mechanism for the health law. And Article 22, which talks about the treaty adoption, it says that the regulations enter into force for all members after due notice is given of World Health Assembly, except for members that notify the Director General of rejection or reservation within a specified time. Now, under Article 22, the reason has to be stated as to why a particular treaty or a particular regulation has been rejected or not. And there is an important aspect to it. A state party has to accept or reject a treaty clearly. If the state does not express its consent at all, then it will be implied that it has accepted the treaty. So your silence amounts to acceptance. And this is a departure, a complete radical departure from the law of the treaty, and a complete departure from the sovereign equality of states. So, as far as the acceptance and acceding to the treaty system is concerned, we can see that the World Health Organization, the constitution of the WHO, is pretty strong. Now, by the power that have been vested in the World Health Organization, it has the power to create certain regulations, the regulations to supervise the international global health at an international level. And this comes within Article 21. Under Article 21, the World Health Assembly has been given quasi-legislative powers to supervise sanitation, quarantine, and other interventions. And it also has the power to decide the nomenclature of diseases, the causes of death, and standards for safety, purity, and potency of the biological and pharmaceutical products moving in international commerce. So, by exercising this power under Article 21, the World Health Organization and the World Health Organization has went on to create international health regulations, the famous IHR. Now, IHR, in my assessment, is a unique meeting point of human rights, trade law, and health law. In totality, is composed of 66 articles, divided into 10 parts and subdivided into 9 annexures. And it has 196 state parties. Now, this is a very less appreciated fact that the membership of World Health Organization exceeds the membership of the Charter of United Nations. Now, the Article 1 of International Health Regulation goes on to define many terms, disease, event. Well, I'm not going detail into the detail of each and every term, but the term that is of most important for us is something that is called PHEIC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern. Now, public health emergency of international concern, whenever a particular disease or an infection is declared as a public health emergency of international concern. In other words, it has been declared a pandemic. Now, what exactly is a public health emergency international concern? It is an extraordinary event which is determined to constitute a public health risk to other states through the international spread of disease and to potentially require a coordinated international response. So, this is how the World Health Organization defines the term pandemic, what actually is a pandemic, and whether a particular situation is a pandemic or not. It shall be decided by the Director General of the World Health Organization, and he does it by exercising his power under Article 12. And I must state here that the Director General is solely responsible for declaring a particular situation as a pandemic. And in addition to Article 12, he has to get in touch or bring in confidence or bring into his confidence the World Health Organization Emergency Committee. So consensus has to be developed between these two organs, the Director General and the Emergency Committee of the WHO. But the ultimate judgment has to be made by the Director General of World Health Organization. Now, as far as Article 2 and Article 3 of the international health regulations are concerned, they tend to strike a balance between international trade, health law, and human rights. Now, Article 2 clearly states that the main function of the international health regulation is to prevent, protect, and control the public health response without an unnecessary interference in international traffic and trade. So, as such, the restrictions that have been imposed, they should not impede the growth of international trade and commerce. Now, as far as Article 3 is concerned, Article 3 is the epicenter of the balance between the health law and human rights. And it clearly states that state parties must have full respect for the dignity and human rights of the fundamental freedoms of the people as prescribed under the Charter of United Nations Organization as well as World Health Organization. Now, interestingly, Article 43, Para 2 of International Health Regulation, it clearly states that health measures cannot be more restrictive of trade and human rights than needed. That means whatever regulations have been imposed by the member states in response to a pandemic, they have to be of proportionate nature. The restrictions should not be so severe that it tends to damage the human rights regime and the trade rights regime. So the IHR regulations is trying to strike a balance between health regulations and the trade law and the human rights. Now, as far as Article 32 of the international health regulations are concerned, it clearly strikes a balance between human rights of the travelers and the health law or the measures prescribed by the member state parties. Article 32 is of the view that the human rights of international travelers should be safeguarded. The state parties must treat travelers with respect and with dignity, and human rights and fundamental of these travelers must be uh, respected in all sense. They should be treated with utmost respect and courtesy. Now, if we connect Article 32 with Article 23, Para 3 of International Health Regulations, in Article 23, Para 3 says that medical examinations, vaccinations, and other health measures that are applied on the travelers shall not be invasive in nature, and these cannot be done without the prior permission of the traveler. Article 31, Para 2 says that if the traveler refuses to give this consent, the state party may deny entry to that particular traveler, and the state may compel the traveler to submit to medical examination or vaccination. So we can clearly see that the in addition of having the health law, the IHR is trying to strike a balance between human rights and health law. Now come some controversial aspects of international health regulation, something that has some aspects have already been dealt by Professor, but I would like to give my own contribution. Articles 5 to 9 of international health regulation, they come within the heading of surveillance, notification, and information sharing. So this is the crux of international health regulation, and this is the part that comes into play whenever there is an outbreak of a pandemic. Now, the member states are supposed to have a surveillance capacity. They have to develop core capacity to detect, assess, and report events that may result into a pandemic or if a pandemic has already broken out. And as Professor Jastori already mentioned, the ever controversial Article 6 of International Health Regulations, it imposes a duty on the member states to notify the World Health Organization of an event that may constitute a public health emergency of international concern, and the World Health Organization is to be informed within 24 hours of its outbreak. Now, at the same time, if the outbreak is of such a nature, and as we have already seen that countries like China, it recently has been saying that China was trying to hide the fact that Wuhan was under the epidemic attack, and it tried to hide information during 2003 during the SARS epidemic, and obviously it will try to evade the authorities by not giving the government data. But there is a solution to that under international health regulations. Article 9 and Article 10 of international health regulations clearly state that in case the government authorities are not cooperating with World Health Organization, then the World Health Organization may take into account the unofficial sources, such as statements by the non-governmental organization, independent scientists, and social network or other news report. In fact, the World Health Organization has established an agency for this. It is called GOARN, GOARN, Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network. So it's nothing but a collaboration of institutions and networks that pulls in all the information from the NGOs and other media and from the scientists itself. And as far as the World Health Organization is concerned, it must use epidemiological principles to assess the reports from these unofficial resources. The sources, for obvious reasons, are supposed to be kept confidential if justified. Now, another important aspect that creates a nexus between human rights and the IHR, the IHR, the law of IHR, is Article 45. Article 45 is of the view that state parties must keep personally identified or identified patient information confidential, and all such information must be processed anonymously as required by the national law. So there can be no revelation as to the identity and status of the international of a person suffering from coronavirus. Now comes the most important or most controversial aspect. Now, the controversial aspect is the dispute settlement procedure under the World Health Organization and international health regulations. Now, the related article is Article 56. Article 56 has provided for a voluntary dispute settlement process. The Article 56 or the dispute settlement procedure of the international health regulations is based on the subsidiarity principle that is found under Article 33 of Charter of United Nations. Now, the principle of subsidiarity in international law, it clearly states that whenever there is a dispute between two powers, between two member states, they should not approach the center of the powers. They should approach the lower authorities first. And if they are not able to resolve the dispute by resorting to the lower authorities, it is only at the end that you should approach the highest authority possible. Now, as far as Article 56 is concerned, that it clearly says that first of all, the member states shall try to solve the disputes among themselves. Okay, so first of all, the member state shall try to solve the situation by resorting to the methods of negotiation, mediation, or conciliation. So so negotiations, it's always between the two member states, and if that is not successful, go for mediation or conciliation, involve third party. So it's not that you directly go to the Director General or you directly go to the World Health Organization. First, try and solve the problem among yourself. If that is not possible, then you go to the Director General of World Health Organization. Now, arbitration is possible at any point. Now, dispute between the two members of the state parties. shall be referred to the world can also be referred to World Health Assembly. Now, this is stated under Article 75. Now, Article 75 can be interpreted in a very radical way. It says that you can approach the World Health Assembly, and if situation is not sorted out, you can approach International Court of Justice. Now, recently, in the case of Russia versus Ukraine, International Court of Justice has interpreted the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination in a very tricky manner. It says that if there is a treaty clause, and if in that treaty clause there is a method for settlement of dispute among the organization of the treaty, the member states can agree to bypass that dispute settlement mechanism in the treaty system and can directly approach the International Court of Justice. So as far as Article 75 is concerned, if it is to be interpreted in the in the light of the judgment as given by International Court of Justice in Russia versus Ukraine, the parties can even approach the International Court of Justice. Now, as far as the liability of a particular country is concerned, like it has become very popular to blame China. So let us assess the legal mechanism that can be resorted against a particular country. But I'll try and avoid the use of China because it's not really settled as to whether they should be solely blamed for the outbreak of coronavirus. And I'm a bit skeptical about as to how the international machinery is going to work. Now, if we were to blame a particular country X, so the law that is applicable here is the state responsibility, or most, and to be more specific, it is the ILC International Law Commission draft on state responsibility of 2002. Now, as far as state responsibility is concerned, state responsibility at an international level simply means responsibility in international law simply means the violation of a legal obligation that is owed by one state to the other. So if one state has a duty towards the other state, and if there is a breach of that duty, then arises the notion of state responsibility. And if state responsibility has been violated, then the ILC draft on state responsibility gives a lot of measures, a lot of remedies to the affected or the aggrieved state in the form of reparations, in the form of accord, satisfaction, and other factors. So if we were to hold China or any other country accountable for the outbreak of the coronavirus, how can we initiate this machinery under the regime of state responsibility? Now, the notion of state responsibility, uh, first of all, it divides the notion of accountability into something that is called primary and secondary norms. So, the law of state responsibility, the law of state responsibility is usually the law of secondary obligation. Now, what is the difference between the primary and the secondary obligations? Primary obligations are those obligations which are very well settled in international law. For example, if we take Article 2, Para 4 of Charter of United Nations. Now, Article 2, Para 4 of Charter of United Nations talks about the use of force and the violation of territorial integrity. This is a fixed notion of international law. This is the primary obligation. And if Article 2, Para 4 is violated, then comes the secondary obligations, which is nothing but state responsibility. Now, as far as state responsibility is concerned, it reflects the international customary law, and we should keep in mind that its nomenclature is ILC draft. So draft by in itself is not binding, but since all the articles that have been drafted in this particular draft, they represent customary international law, so it is acceptable. It is acceptable as a source of international law. So as far as state responsibility is concerned, it is state responsibility is usually considered as the law of civil responsibility. Primarily, it is not dealing with something that is called criminal responsibility. So as far as civil responsibility of one state towards other state is concerned, there are three issues. There are three issues or three theories of responsibility. One is the fault theory, one is the strict liability theory, and the third is the absolute liability theory. Now, when we resort to the fault theory of state responsibility, the aggrieved state has to prove that the other state has performed certain negligent acts. When we talk about the strict liability, in strict liability, the aggrieved party has to show that the other party has violated some norms of international law. And as far as strict liability is concerned, certain exceptions are entertained. Now, when we talk about absolute liability, the focus is not on negligence, it is not on the breach of law, but the claimant just have to prove that a particular state is liable to pay damages to it. So these are the three conditions that that govern the law of state responsibility. Now, the next step in state responsibility is the doctrine of attribution. The doctrine of attribution, as contained under Article 4 to Article 11 of ILC draft on state responsibility. So, attribution simply means that whatever international wrongful act has been committed by a state, it has to be attributed to one of the organs of the state. It has to be it must be performed by one of the organs of the state, that is legislature, executive, or judiciary, as given under Article 4. Now, as far as the role of private actors are concerned, even private actors can be attributed as state organs, provided they are performing one of the functions that were mainly to be performed by the state government, but because of certain circumstances, these are being governed by private organs. So we can see that if we were to prosecute a particular country like China, and if you were to blame a particular organ of the government, then the health ministry, the Politburo, and even the virological labs, even they can be sued by the virtue of Article 4 and Article 5 of the ILC draft of state responsibility. Now, there is an interesting article, Article 8 of ILC draft on state responsibility. Now, Article 8 is it deals with a specific situation where the function that was to be performed by the state actors are not performed by one of its organs, but they are indirectly performed by them. So, if there is an indirect performance of your state obligation, what is the test to be understood? There are two tests. One is the instruction test, and one is the overall liability test. So, if there is an organ of a state and if it is performing certain illegal actions on the territory of the other state, but it is doing it indirectly, maybe it's employing certain mercenaries, or maybe it has employed certain private actors, then how can the activities of these private actors be attributed to the state? So the International Court of Justice has over the years come up with two tests. One is the instruction test. In the instruction test, we just have to see whether a state is controlling the action of these private bodies through a remote control or not. Whatever instructions are being given, whether are they being followed. If yes, then the action is attributed to you and you are held accountable under the ILC draft on state responsibility. And a new test that has evolved in recent times, it is the overall control test. So it is more serious than the impact test. Now, the overall test or the overall control test says that even if the situation can be indirectly attributed to you or remotely attributed to you, even then you are accountable under Article 8. Now, let's say if we were to hold accountable if we hypothetically argue that China is responsible for the outbreak of the COVID-19, then what are the defenses that China can take? Okay, so this must be kept in mind. So there are three articles in ILC draft responsibility which provides the exceptions or the defenses to the state. These three articles are Article 23, 24, and 25. Article 23 talks about the famous doctrine of force majeure. Article 24 talks about the defense of distress, and Article 25 talks about the defense of necessity. Now, as far as force majeure is concerned, it simply states that whenever a member state is not is precluded from performing its obligations, if there is an unforeseen and unstoppable force, an unseen and unforeseen or irresistible force has allowed the state not to perform its usual treaty obligations. So if there is an irresistible force which could not be foreseen by the member state and it had made it materially impossible for that member state to perform its treaty obligations, then it can be saved from the application of state responsibility. It is no longer liable, provided the state party itself is not the wrongdoer, and if the state party itself has consented to the harm. So that means plaintiff the wrongdoer and voluntary non-fit injury are the two exceptions. So force majeure can always be resorted. Next is Article 25, necessity. Now, necessity is very strictly interpreted. It is rarely used because it clearly says that necessity shall not be used as a defense. These are the opening lines of Article 25, that necessity as a defense shall not be used until and unless it can be proved that the member states were under a grave imperil to subvert a lesser evil. So, as far as force majeure is concerned, force majeure is not giving you an option. It clearly states that there is an unforeseen circumstances, there is an irresistible force, and the situation is completely out of your hand. There was nothing that you could do. But in necessity, there is a choice, and the member state is choosing a lesser evil. So that is the situation. But as I've already stated, the defense of necessity is rarely pleaded. It is very difficult to save your case by using these exceptions given under the ILC draft on state resolution. Now, as far as Article 24 is concerned, Article 24 can be used by China or any other country that is to be blamed for the outbreak of pandemic. Now, Article 24 talks about distress. Now, distress and necessity both are similar in nature. Both are trying to avoid a greater evil by resorting to a lesser evil, something that we have seen in Section 81 of IPC2. But as far as distress is concerned, distress is a particular application of Article 25. That means Article 24, distress is a particular application of necessity, and distress is applicable when a state is trying to save the life and limb of its own citizens. So this is the argument that China can resort in case it is pleaded in any appropriate judicial tribunal. Now comes the tricky part, the trickiest part of them all. That if we were to sue China before any particular judicial tribunal, what exact measures can we take, or is it even possible? So let us see the options that are available before us. Now, as far as the constitution of the IHR International Health Regulation is concerned, we have clearly seen that it is based on a voluntary dispute settlement as given under Article 56. And I've already discussed how through the judgment of Russia and Ukraine, it can directly approach the International Court of Justice. Now, as far as the International Court of Justice all of my learned colleagues are aware of the fact that we can broadly divide the issue of jurisdiction of ICJ under two headings. That is the contentious jurisdiction, and the other is advisory jurisdiction. Now, if a particular country approached the contentious jurisdiction of International Court of Justice, and it approaches under Article 36 para 2 of International Court of Justice, that is the compulsory jurisdiction, I don't think that that case will succeed, because China has not given its consent to the compulsory jurisdiction of ICJ under Article 36 para 2. And there is no scope for an automatic assumption of jurisdiction by ICJ. If a member state has not given its consent to Article 36 para 1 or Article 36 para 2 of ICJ, then ICJ simply cannot assume its jurisdiction. So if a case is brought under Article 36 para 2 of ICJ, then that is not going to succeed. So what are the options that are available before us? Just in case we make a hypothetical argument that China is responsible, first of all, we'll have to prove the case. So in my opinion, the best option is resorting to the advisory jurisdiction of International Court of Justice. Now, as far as the advisory jurisdiction of International Court of Justice is concerned, let me clarify the basics of this jurisdiction. There are two main organs that that can resort to the advisory jurisdiction, and that is the General Assembly and Security Council. And in addition to General Assembly and Security Council, the General Assembly can give permission to any other organ of the Charter of United Nations or any subsidiary organ of the Charter of United Nations to approach the International Court of Justice in its advisory jurisdiction capacity. So far, General Assembly has given the consent to many subsidiary organs, including World Health Organization. So General Assembly via resolution has given the consent to World Health Organization to approach the International Court of Justice under Article 96 for the advisory jurisdiction. Now, as far as advisory jurisdiction is concerned, it is usually given on the point of law. So, World Health Organization or any or the General Assembly or the Security Council can approach the International Court of Justice and question whether China has violated Article 6, Article 7 of International Health Regulations, Article 18, as already mentioned by Professor Jastoria in his lecture. Article 18 of Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties. Has it violated Article 37 of the Constitution of World Health Organization? So, advisory jurisdiction is the best option that is available before us in case we want to settle the situation in a legal manner. Now comes the next question: is the advisory jurisdiction binding on the member parties? Now, this is a tricky situation because the advisory jurisdiction does not come within the definition of judgment as given under Article 59 of the Statute of ICJ. Now, if it's not coming within the judgment, then it's going to create problem. But as per the judgments of International Court of Justice and as per the commentaries given by Bruno Sima and other authorities, if the parties have approached International Court of Justice on a point of law, then by virtue of approaching a particular issue on a point of law, the advisory jurisdiction of International Court of Justice will be binding. So this is one option. And secondly, most of the cases that have been decided by International Court of Justice through its advisory jurisdiction are now a part and parcel of international law via customary international law. If we look at the judgment of International Court of Justice in the legality of use of nuclear weapons, 1996, and in 1949, where it recognized Charter of United Nations as a legal personality, the reparations case. So the reparation case and both legality of use of nuclear weapons case, the judgments of International Court of Justice now have a customary value. So whatever judgment is given by advisory under the advisory jurisdiction, it can become a potent source of law. Now, in addition to these, what else can be done? Now, through this platform of BBAU University, I would like to say that if the parties want a political settlement of the dispute, they can resort to Article 34 of Charter of United Nations, and that is the investigation power of the Charter of the investigation power of uh, the Security Council. Now, Security Council under the Charter of United Nations is the only organ that has been explicitly given the power to investigate a particular issue. Although General Assembly and uh, the Secretary General have also been given the power to investigate, but Security Council is the most important option. Now, when we are dealing with Article 34 in the inquiry that is set up, so if we are trying to implicate both World Health Organization and China, suppose we say there is an even nexus between the two, the most important and the most viable option is Article 34 of Charter of United Nations. Under the Inquiry Commission, the Security Council can resort to the discovery of the truth, ascertaining the facts of events, including causes of origin. So, this point too is very important because the Security Council may investigate the origins of the evil nexus between World Health Organization and China if there is any. It can call for reports and it can call for hearing of the witnesses. Now, as far as Article 34 is concerned, Article 34 unfortunately is also subject to the veto power of the permanent members under Article 27, Para 3. And most importantly, states are under a legal obligations to carry out the decision of the investigation committee because the findings of this investigation committee is binding on the members by virtue of Article 25 of the Charter of United Nations. And the fact that Article 34 and 25 are outside the ambit of Chapter 7, it does not diminish its legal value. Now, lastly, the method that I'm just making a hypothetical argument here. The Security Council can consider this pandemic situation as a threat to peace under Article 39. So, under Article 39, the Security Council, first of all, determines. The word determine is very important. It determines the existence of any threat to peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression. Now, under Article 39, when a Security Council makes a determination of an issue, it does not merely register a fact. Its function is not mere, it's evaluative in nature, and it performs a quasi-judicial function. So under Article 39, it can treat the situation as a threat to peace, but that will be an extreme situation. But since we are talking about the nexus between global health law and international law, I think an argument can be made. So that was my descriptive analysis of the existing law of World Health Organization and the international health law. So I tried to cover the existing law. I'm not making it a descriptive lecture. I'm not giving any sort of opinion. I'm just stating the law as it is. So in the true stride of legal positivism, I've just stated the available legal machinery that is available before us, the existing law as it exists, and the options that are available before us. Rest, time will tell. So with this, I conclude my lecture. Thanks for being patient with me, and thanks for bearing me. Thank you so much.
Now I would like to invite Professor Arvind for a few words.
Audible. I thank you, Professor Preeti Mishra and Professor Preeti Saxena, and all the faculty members of the university, and Dr. Bhanu also for giving the detailed interpretation. case, and let's hope that the way nations are going over this coronavirus pandemic and the way they are going to tackle, because as I told you that WHO resolution has come on Tuesday for an impartial investigation into the corona pandemic. Let's hope probably a settlement can be reached and the world will be again on sustainable path. With these words also, I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and the faculty members also for giving me opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Of course, there are other issues also pertaining to this, particularly international environment lies there, international human rights lies there, but that would go a very long way in discussing each and every conventions at the principle which would be applicable in this particular case. We can take it on some other days. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such an informative session from your side, sir. Thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Thank you.
Now I invite Professor Saxena ma'am for her presidential remarks.
So, first of all, I would congratulate the Department of Human Rights for conducting such a beautiful seminar by inviting the speakers of, we can say, a very, very high level. Professor Jasrotia, we can say that he's a master of international law, environmental law, and very beautifully he had articulated as to what is the relation between the pandemic and global health at international perspective. Due to some 2G and 4G, we can say snag, we couldn't hear him properly. But I suppose that he must have articulated very well and nicely on this topic which has been given to him. The second speaker, Dr. Bhanu, and we are proud on you, Bhanu, for being the alumni of our department. So very elaborately, you have discussed each and every aspect of this pandemic and global health with respect to the International Sanitary Convention, International Health Regulation, then WHO, and the treaties, various treaties you have discussed along with the ICJ and the system as to whether any advisory opinion can be taken from the International Court of Justice or not in that reference. So very well articulated speech by Dr. Bhanu also. And I was just going through the live comments of the participants who are just, watching this webinar, that wonderful comments have been given by those participants in that reference. And really, I congratulate the entire department, Dr. Shashi Kumar, Dr. Rashida, Dr. Priti Mishra, for holding a beautiful webinar on this subject. And as we all know that global health is an issue which has to be tackled by the WHO, which is just a consequence of the 14, we can say, international sanitary conferences held between 1851 to 1938. And after that, the International Health Convention of New York in 1946, that this WHO has come into existence. But the role of the WHO is also at stake this time, and it is being criticized by various, we can say, stakes. Number one, if the WHO has been informed from China in December 2019 that there is a case of the coronavirus in China, but for declaring it as a pandemic, the World Health Organization took almost 3 months. On 11th March is declared as a pandemic. So as far as globalization is concerned, we say that this has created very good things for us, not only for the states, but for the individuals also. But at the same time, the international trade, international traffic, international traveling, these are all the issues which are to be taken into care with when there is a pandemic like the spread of the any of the virus, be it cholera, be it plague, be it Spanish flu, H1N1, and a number of pandemics. Because as everybody knows that this is not for the first time that this pandemic or this virus has been spread. There have been cases earlier also, and this is going not to be the last one also. There may be some more viruses spread in the future also. But as to what are the provisions under international health regulation, as notification, reservation, everything has been very broadly interpreted and told by Dr. Bhanu and Professor Jasrodia ji. So I don't have any word to say that I may include something or I may add upon in that speeches of the two previous speakers. But I would like to thank the department as well as our guest speakers, that because of them this webinar would see a great success. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my views with you on this pandemic, on global health and international law in that respect. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much.
ma'am. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Dr. Rashida Atahat for her vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, one and all. It's my proud privilege to propose vote of thanks on this very special occasion of one-day national webinar on topic on pandemic global health and the response of international law, organized by Department of Human Rights, Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar, Central University, Lucknow. In this reference, first and foremost, I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to our most revered Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sanjay Singh ji. He has always been a source of enthusiasm and inspiration for us, and without his blessing, we would not have been able to witness this historic event. So thank you, sir. Thank you for your support. I also convey my deep sense of gratitude, regard, and hearty thanks to our respected speakers, Professor Arvind Jasrotia sir, former Head and Dean, Department of Law, University of Jammu, for graciously accepting our invitation and consenting to be the one of the speakers to this webinar. Sir, thank you very much for sharing your views on the theme. It was actually very, very informative. I express my sincere thanks, rather a very happy thanks to our another speaker, Dr. Bhanu Pratap, who is also one of the alumni of our department and presently Assistant Professor, Department of Law, University of Lucknow, for sharing his views on the theme. Dr. Bhanu, thank you very much. It was very articulated and very informative and thought-provoking indeed. Thank you very much. I convey my heartfelt thanks to Professor Preeti Saxena ma'am, Director, Center for Postgraduate Legal Studies, and Professor of Department of Human Rights, Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University. She is also the patron of today's webinar. And ma'am, thank you very much for giving the presidential remarks. And we are also thankful to you for your constant motivation and guidance to organize this national webinar. Thank you, ma'am. Let me put on
Thank
record
you,
my
Rashida.
gratitude to Professor Priti Mishra, Head Department of Human Rights, and the organizing director of the national webinar. Thank you, ma'am, for organizing this webinar on a very, very important topic like this and making all of us awaken in this time of COVID-19, in this time of crisis of COVID-19, rather we should say. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
I am
Rashida.
very
Thank you.
thankful to Dr. Shashi Kumar sir, Associate Professor, Department of Human Rights, Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, and one of the coordinators of this national webinar for introducing our respected and distinguished speakers. Thank you, sir. Now, I convey my heartfelt thanks to all the participants from the different part of the country, including the distinguished faculty members, students, and research scholars. I consider that their presence is the major contributing factor toward the successful completion of the seminar. So thank you all. Last but not the least, I express my special thanks to the moderator of this national webinar, Mr. Shishir Yadav, who has conducted this seminar in a good manner. Thank you, Shishir. Once again, I on my personal behalf and on behalf of Department of Human Rights, thank you all. Thank you very much. And I congratulate to the team of organizing this national webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashida. You are also the part of the same organizing committee. So congrats to
Thank you,
you
ma'am.
also. My special congrats and thanks to Shishir Yadav for giving his technical support in organizing this particular national webinar on such an important issue during this crisis period. I thank you one and all for for participating in this wonderful webinar. Thank you all. Now we are signing off from the studio and see you in future in some other event. Thank you.
Thank,
Thank you.
Okay.
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I thank all the speakers for their insightful content and taking us through the aftermath of the pandemic. I would like to conclude with a couplet. That's what is incredible about human beings is the choice to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Shishiv. Thank you so much.